Of the four Gospels, three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have at least one chapter in each Gospel in which Jesus discusses end-time matters. We call these the eschatological discourses, the discourses of the end times. And we naturally hear elements of that at this time of the year. As I've mentioned before, we're coming to the end of our liturgical year and the beginning of the new liturgical year, just in 2 weeks. Each one is one chapter in which Jesus talks about aspects of the end that in many ways coincides with events that either were or by the time the gospel was written had happened in terms of, say, the Jewish insurrection, the Roman Empire and its occupation, times of wars and famines, and worry of the end times in relation to them. At least 3 times he says, if anyone says, I am he and the time has come, don't listen to them. And once in each one, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he says, no one knows the day or the hour. It's pretty common, although there are some differences between each presentation in each gospel. But the Gospel of Matthew extends that discourse to another chapter in which, building upon what he's just taught, Jesus offers 3 parables to illustrate the end time, the coming of the kingdom. And we hear these 3 parables over these last couple of weeks of our liturgical year. Last week we heard the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, the wise and foolish bridesmaids. Next week we will hear the parable of the Last Judgment, Jesus dividing those on his right and those on his left. This week we hear the parable of the talents and a comparison of what the kingdom of heaven is like and the coming of the Son of Man is like. Again, not what it will be exactly, but what it will be like. And we have the example of the 3 men, the one who received 5, the one who received 2, and the one who received 1. And they're named talents. And in relating to these particular stories, in this particular parable, we can relate in terms of our own talents, the gifts that God has given us. I remember my 6th grade teacher, the late Mrs. Mary Higgins, very saintly woman, always reminded us that the question God would ask us is not how much money we made or how successful we were in certain things, but very simply, what did you do with what I gave you? Of course, it's a little more complex than that, but we were 6th graders. But you would always, I've never forgotten that. What did you do with what I gave you? But every now and again, we tend to look at these gifts that God gives us in light of today's parable as talents. What are our skills? Did we use our skills and our talents, the things that we're good at, in a way that was beneficial? But that's not entirely an accurate way of looking at it. I mean, even such great people as Gerard Manley Hopkins, a great poet, a man of great writing skills, one of the great poets of England in the late 1800s. When he became a Jesuit, he gave up doing that as an act of humility. He actually gave up writing poetry. He had to be ordered by his superior to write another great poem called The Wreck of the Deutschland on the occasion of the Wreck of the Deutschland that killed a number of sisters who were leaving Germany in exile during the reign of the Kaiser. But here's a man with a great talent, but out of humility, he chose not to do it once he became a Jesuit. Up and until, under obedience, he was asked to do it. Is he neglecting his talent? Is he burying it in the sand? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Until we remember, of course, that in the time of Christ, and especially in the Roman Empire, a talent was a unit of currency. Years later, we have the same word meaning skills, that were something we're good at. It'd be almost as if Jesus told this parable in England, and he said the king gave them 5 pounds. Well, he doesn't mean the kind of a weight that we have or how much weight we need to lose. The term pound is a unit of currency in England. A talent was a unit of currency in the ancient Roman Empire. So we could also understand this parable not just in terms of skills that we must cultivate, but also what are the gifts that God gives us and how do we make good use of them specifically for the spreading of the kingdom, because this is the Gospel of Matthew. And the very last thing he says in the Gospel to his disciples are, go and make disciples of all the nations. The theme of spreading the gospel to the Gentiles is very much a theme in the Gospel of Matthew. So what are the gifts that God has given us that are meant for the building up of the kingdom and the spread of the gospel, and how do we make use of those as we prepare for the king to come again? How do we make use of those gifts that God has given us? They could easily be the skills and talents that we have. Again, back to Gerard Manley Hopkins. Many people have been moved to faith because of his wonderful poetry. But it could also be perhaps the vocations that we have. And they may be received in varying degrees. For example, perhaps no one is given more greater responsibility in our church in terms of safeguarding the gospel than our bishops. There we might see people who've received the 5 talents as opposed to priests Regular Catholics in the pews, the growing responsibility of safeguarding the gospel. Now, just in case you're wondering, this is not a commentary of any particular bishop or any particular pope, in case you happen to have certain ones in mind. I'm not doing that, trust me. But woe be any of us as priests if we neglect the calling we have as shepherds of souls. Whether it be a deacon, a priest, a bishop, or anyone with a vocation to spread that gospel. Because one thing we see in the gospel here, we presume, of course, the one with the one talent, but he just happens to be the one in this parable who buried his talent. It could have been the one who received 2. It could have been the one who received 5. And how disastrous that would have been if the one who received 5 had buried it. How much more catastrophic for him it would have been if he had been the one who, out of fear, didn't make use of the 5 talents that were given to him. But as the parable gives, it's the one who had 1. But in another place in the gospel, Jesus says, much is expected to those who are given much, and more is expected to those who are given more. So that fits perfectly into today's parable. So it could be a vocation of shepherds of souls. But this isn't the only vocation. It could be the vocation of parenthood. Some people have a few children. Some people have more. Some have 2. Some have 5. Some have 10. Some families have 17. And the responsibility of parents to pass that faith on to the next generation. Do they neglect that? Do they live that life as parents in such a way that at the end, the number of people following Christ in the family has increased rather than decreased? Children are a gift from God, something that God has given to them. Are they families with special needs children? And there are other such examples as well. So it could just not be a skill or a talent or that we are particularly good at, but rather the vocation and the calling that one has given us. What do we make of that calling? And for some, it's varying degrees of that calling, just as we see varying degrees of the talents in today's gospel. Finally, how do we look at the very faith that we have received? Do we see it as a talent that God has given us, a gift that God has given us? I mean, after all, there are those who live their entire life at different points in history, even to today, where they're not in a position to have received the gospel, let alone embrace it. There's that age-old question, is there salvation outside the church? And I'm not going to really belabor that whole question. It's a question we've been asking ourselves for centuries, and we'll be debating of it for centuries to come. But do we see it as a question of the talent, a gift that God has given us of our faith? Is God going to punish people who at certain points in history did not live at a time or a place in which they never heard the gospel, let alone could respond to it? They weren't given that gift of faith, as opposed to some of us who did hear it and respond to it, converts to the faith, who've heard it, responded, and lived it. And then those of us who were born into it, had the gift of being born into a family of the Catholic faith, whose parents raised us in the Catholic faith. This is something we've been given. But do we bury it in the sand because we're afraid, or just simply we don't want to bother? Is it something we seek to cultivate, to spread that gospel, or are we raised in that faith and then we just kind of put it aside, bury it in the sand because things we don't like, or we're afraid of being judged too harshly? I'm not going to say who's going to heaven or not in terms of that judgment, but tell me how receiving a faith and being raised into it all our lives and then neglecting that faith or forsaking it later gets us to heaven. But that's another example in which we can look at the talents or the gifts that God has given us to cultivate. We are called to have this faith. We are called to profess this faith. Some of us were blessed to be called to be born into a Catholic family, to be raised in the Catholic faith. And how much more are we called to cultivate that for the sake of the kingdom and not to neglect it either by choice or by fear or by simple, falling asleep as the foolish bridesmaids did last week, rather than cultivating that great gift. And so this is another example of what we do to prepare ourselves for the coming of the kingdom. And we do well, as we see here. I'm preaching to the choir. We're here cultivating that faith. We're here to receive the Eucharist. We're here to hear the Word of God and apply it in real ways to our lives so that we can more fully and more substantially live it. And we pray, pass it on to the next generation so that it can move on to the next generation, and so that that call that Jesus gave the apostles, go and make disciples of all the nations, doesn't end with us or our generation. But let us be aware of all the many gifts that God has given us, whether they are literal, in terms of the English language at least, talents that we are called to cultivate and make use of, whether it's a calling or a vocation that we have, or whether it's the very faith that we profess, that we don't bury it in the sand out of fear or neglect or just basic practice of making excuses for being lazy and worthless, as the master proclaims that receiver of the one talent, but that we are shown that we can be relied upon in small matters and therefore relied upon in big matters, because in making use of those gifts that God has given us, we too pray that God will look upon us and say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."